Bill, Craig, a warm welcome to this podcast with Damaris Norway and the NLA University College.
Thank you, Lars. It's just wonderful to be connected with you folks in Norway again. Jan and I have fond memories of our last visit, and so I'm glad to do this podcast today.
And I think it was actually in 2012, wasn't it, when you visited us?
Yes, and just had a marvelous time.
So, but now you are in Atlanta at the time of recording for very natural reasons because of the lockdown and all that. Could you give us a glimpse of how life is at the moment?
Well, I almost feel a little embarrassed to say that the pandemic has had very little effect upon my lifestyle. I typically study and write from morning until evening, and that's been uninterrupted by the virus. In fact, it's actually made me more productive because I've canceled a few speaking engagements. And so this has actually given me more time for my study and writing. So I think that people who are writers or artists or composers who typically work alone in their studio or their office or workshop are not as affected as many people are who work in offices or factories and things of that sort.
And your work right now, from following your newsletters and from following some of the podcasts, it seems to have a real clear focus just for the time being on the historical Adam. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. I first spent a year studying the biblical material concerning Adam. And then over the last year, I have poured myself into the scientific literature about the time of the origin of humanity on this planet with a view toward trying to see when a primordial human founding pair might have lived.
Is this a fairly new area for you in terms of exploring it, or have you done it before?
You know, I have thought about it, obviously, in the past. I think every reflective Christian has thought about it, but I have never given such intense, focused, extensive study to the issue before. So it has been a source of great revelation and insight for me.
So when you are working on that, what will be the results of it? Will you publish a book or maybe a couple of books? Usually you find it into more than one book, I understand.
Yeah. Well, what I plan to do is to publish a book called The Quest of the Historical Adam. And this would be a two-part book surveying first the biblical data and then secondly the scientific data, and then ending with some theological reflections on this. In addition to that, though, I've committed to doing a joint book with the biologist Joshua Swamidass, who has also written on the historical Adam, and we would do a book together where I would do biblical material and he would do scientific material.
Fascinating. Thanks for keeping us updated. Actually, I think it was yesterday that we actually have two daily newspapers with a Christian profile in Norway, amazingly enough. And one of them highlighted a news report, or actually an interview with Joshua Swamidass, where he was presented. So quite a few people, as of yesterday in Norway, would know of his work. And actually you were quoted as well. You were quoted about, So you see there are some people who follow things that are happening even in Norway. That's amazing.
Yeah. Wow, that's tremendous.
Yes. So the occasion for this, or the background for this podcast, is actually twofold. One is the fact that we are partnering with Reasonable Faith, your ministry, to do a subtitling of 6 of the animated videos which have attracted so much attention. And then we are also, with the academic hat on, we are actually having a course right now on apologetics, and where some of your material is featured. So thanks a lot, Bill, for being with us. And in your book, Reasonable Faith, by the way, it was the book that gave the name to the web ministry, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It seemed so natural to use the name of my signature book as the name of the website and the ministry. So yes, that's correct.
Do you remember why you came up with the title in the first place?
Yes, I do, in fact, which is rather funny. I originally wanted to title the book Faith on the Offensive. It would be a kind of positive apologetic for the Christian faith.
So then offensive in the sense of, like a football team going into...
Exactly. The problem is there's a difference between being on the offensive and being offensive.
That's right. That's right.
That's why the publisher didn't like it. And so it was actually the publisher's suggestion that the book be titled Reasonable Faith. And I didn't like it. To me, it was too milquetoast. There was no excitement in a title like
no edge in it, as it were.
No edge. That's right. And yet, I guess I didn't appreciate for secularists how radical it is to assert that faith can be reasonable. To many people, it's an oxymoron to talk about reasonable faith. So it turns out there is some edge in the title after all, and I am very, very glad that we adopted it.
It seems like a title that really doesn't wear off with time.
Good point.
It's solid in a way. So then you actually named the web ministry that grew out of your books and your lectures and your debates, Reasonable Faith. Yes. When did you actually start the web ministry?
I think that it was around about 12 years ago. We recently celebrated our 10th anniversary, and I think that was 2 or at most 3 years ago. So that would have been when it was founded.
One of the hats I carry is a so-called catalyst for the Lausanne movement in being involved with media engagement. And one of the things we talk about in various contexts is that we are facing the democratization of the media. And I actually quite often use Reasonable Faith as an example. If you go 10 years back, your name was almost only connected with written material, with well, of course, lectures, more oral presentations, and teaching in Talbot or in other contexts. But it's fascinating, isn't it, that what you have experienced is like almost symbolic of the fact that today's world is every Christian ministry is becoming a media ministry.
Yes, it's amazing during this coronavirus time, to illustrate. I have done so many interviews on social media because everyone is exploiting the electronic media to get the message out.
So every church becomes a media ministry. Every Christian organization becomes a media ministry. So we have had the privilege of illustrating that in March, for example, in Uganda and Kenya. And people really get it. And some of them have heard about your ministry and, oh, yes, of course. And then, of course, being led through the web ministry to the written material. I suppose that's something you experience a lot, isn't it?
Well, that's my hope, is that people would watch a debate video and be intrigued and then go and begin to read some of the written material, which is much more substantive and in-depth than the popular presentations on YouTube. So I'm
glad you're saying that it's more substantive, because it's actually quite a lot of substance on the website as well when we look at it. Yeah.
Good.
So in your introduction to the standard textbook, Reasonable Faith, you actually have a definition of apologetics. Let me quote. In addition to serving, like the rest of theology in general, as an expression of loving God with all our minds, apologetics specifically serves to show, and then you continue with 3 different facets. But let us start with the first aspect there. Serving, like the rest of theology in general, as an expression of loving God with all our minds. You have actually committed your life to that part of Christian ministry, the intellectual part.
Yes.
Bill, if I may ask, sort of on a personal note, before we plunge into the actual arguments, what does it mean for you to love God with your mind?
I love the Christian system as a system. there's a worldview here that you have as a Christian that includes things like God's existence, objective moral values and duties grounded in God, human beings made in the image of God and therefore endowed with intrinsic moral value, the creation of the universe and its dependence upon God. There's a whole worldview to be explored here. And I think an expression of loving God with all of our minds is to devote oneself to digesting and articulating that truth and integrating it with non-theological truth that is delivered to us from other disciplines.
So there is a sense of worship there as well, a sense of wonder?
Oh, very much so, yes. The wonder, I think, never goes away because it's so far beyond one that you can never plumb its depths entirely.
That's wonderful. So if we then move on to the whole question about what is the task of apologetics, you use this three facets or three perspectives or dimensions to confirm that faith to believers, to show to unbelievers the truth of the Christian faith, and to reveal and explore the connections between Christian doctrine and other truths. Do you see this as almost like an equal balancing act, or is one of the aspects more important, you think, than the others, or do they constitute a whole?
I do think it constitutes a whole, and at different times and places in history, different facets may need greater emphasis than at other times. Mm-hmm. I find in our work with reasonable faith that many Christians in our society today, because it is so secularized, struggle deeply and desperately with doubt and wonder whether Christianity is really true. And so for them, apologetics is just electrifying. I thought that apologetics would help them intellectually, but what I didn't understand when I began doing this is the way in which it electrifies them spiritually. Once they become convinced that the Christian worldview is really the truth, it just makes them all the more eager to know God, to study the Bible, to share this faith with other people. It has a tremendous spiritual as well as intellectual benefit in the lives of Christians. And then, of course, in our secular culture, I think it's really important that we not just preach the gospel, but that we be prepared to answer the questions and objections that are posed against the Christian faith by the leading spokesmen of secular thought, such as Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and so many others who are speaking out against Christianity. We need to show thinking men and women today that becoming a Christian is a rational step for them to take, and that they can do so without intellectual compromise. And then that third aspect, the integrative aspect, that's important primarily for the task of doing good theology. I think that our theologians really need to study a little bit of analytic philosophy and apologetics in order to do a better job of integrating Christian doctrine and seeing how it all holds together and is integrated with what the other disciplines at the university deliver to us in terms of knowledge.
So, and you mentioned, we talked about the historical Adam question, the whole issue, and of course that could be, that's an example, isn't it, of that, of revealing and exploring the connection between Christian truth.
I think that would be an issue that affects all three of those areas. There are here in the State Lodge some very prominent Christian celebrities who have left the faith, have become non-Christians, primarily because of this issue of the challenge of population genetics to the historical Adam. On the other hand, there are so many unbelievers who say that they cannot become Christians because they can't believe that the world was created a few thousand years ago with this historical Adam and Eve. And so it's a tremendous obstacle to faith for them. And then, as you say, of course, anybody who's doing theological anthropology needs to interact with that issue. In fact, that was what brought me into this subject. I'm hoping to write a systematic philosophical theology. And I knew that I was going to have to treat theological anthropology, and that therefore I needed to bone up on this area. And that was what led me to the study of the historical Adam in greater detail.
So this is like, that part would be like doing your groundwork for preparations for that section.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I did the same thing with the atonement a couple of years ago. I knew I would need to be writing on the atonement as part of the doctrine of salvation and the doctrine of Christ, the work of Christ. And I knew that there were tremendous objections to the atonement today, even among Christian theologians, that hadn't been adequately addressed. And so I spent a couple of years studying full-time the doctrine of the atonement with a view toward giving a robust defense of the Reformation doctrine of substitutionary atonement. And that was a wonderful experience for me. And as you say, was laying the groundwork for this later philosophical theology.
And of course, I imagine also the sense of wonder at the heart of the Christian faith, where we're exploring. I think you have said a few times that it was a huge privilege to be able to commit such a lot of time, focusing, exploring, like God's heart, as it were.
Yes, it hit me very powerfully as I did this, that whereas things like the Kalam cosmological argument or the fine-tuning of the universe are important, nonetheless, they're not at the heart of the Christian faith in the way that the doctrine of the atonement is. And so to do this study was very meaningful to me, precisely because it was the heart of Christian theology.
In your recent newsletter, Bill, you refer to a recent visit to Denmark, our neighboring country, just south of where I live. And just a ferry across, and then we are in Denmark. Well, we can't travel there now, of course, but hopefully shortly. And you mentioned something in the newsletter about the possibility of actually integrating about the atonement into the theme of philosophy of time.
Yes, that was unexpected. The conference in Denmark at the University of Aalborg was sponsored by Peter Østrøm, who is a fine Christian Danish philosopher, who is very interested in philosophy of time. This is his bread and butter issue, so to speak. And since I was working on the atonement, he wanted me to try to see if there was any relevance of it to the philosophy of time. And to my surprise, it turns out that there is. And it has to do with the issue of whether or not a divine pardon serves to expunge our guilt. And I think that it does. I think it shows that guilt is just a property which can be temporarily possessed, but then can be expunged through a divine pardon. So that even though I was once guilty in the past, I am not guilty now. And so the relevance of time and tense to this question is one that is important and has even been recognized by the courts in decisions related to pardon and the effect of pardon upon guilt.
If we now take a couple of steps back and moving from the heart of the Christian faith to the question about, is there a God, the existence of God? And then, of course, the occasion for this podcast, I said a few minutes ago, is the fact that we are subtitling into Norwegian the animated videos. And there are, I think, is it 11, 12, 13 or something at the moment?
Yes, nearly.
Like that. So we have, in the first place, at least chosen 6 of them. And that is the Kalam argument, the fine-tuning argument, the morality argument, the claims of Jesus about himself, and the two on the resurrection.
Right.
And that gives us both a background in the whole issue about the existence of God, the three first, and then moving into the heart of the Christian faith, about who Jesus is and what about the resurrection. And I think it would be really interesting for us to ask ourselves, the definition you have in your book, which is very rich, I must say, is about that the Christian faith may be a challenge, or the argument for the Christian faith, rather, about the truth of the Christian faith, as in apologetics, may be challenging to people outside the church or the faith, may be confirming or affirming Christians' belief, and maybe also an area for the exploration of the connections between Christian doctrine and other doctrines. So
Yes.
let's start with the Kalam argument. Actually, I think, am I correct in saying that you were actually the one who revived the argument?
I think it would be fair to say that. It's not original with me. I was inspired to do this work by Stuart Hackett in his book, The Resurrection of Theism. But Hackett's book, published in 1957, went immediately out of print and made not even a ripple effect. But fortunately, I read the book just after graduating from university, and it had a deep impact upon me personally. And so when I went on to the University of Birmingham in England to do my doctoral studies in philosophy, I wanted to write on this particular argument for God's existence. And Professor John Hick, under whom I studied, agreed that that would be a good topic. And so that gave me the opportunity to explore this argument in great depth. And the Lord has since used it tremendously to have an impact.
Before going into the argument as such, you said you moved to Birmingham and had the privilege of studying with John Hick there. And could you give us, not everyone would be familiar with John Hick, so who was he?
John Hick was one of the most highly respected philosophical theologians in the 20th century. He wrote several epical books that received a great deal of acclaim. For example, Evil and the God of Love was a major study of the problem of evil. He wrote on arguments for the existence of God, when very few were doing that at the time. And then perhaps most notoriously, he became a religious pluralist and wrote books in which he argued that all of the various world religions are false misrepresentations of ultimate reality, which he called simply the real, but that they can all be effective agents of change to change our lives from self-centeredness to others-centeredness. And he was making that transition in his own theology during the time that I was writing under him, but it didn't affect my work on the cosmological argument.
And he gave you freedom to explore your avenues.
Yes, that was the wonderful thing about working with Professor Hick, was his open-mindedness and his giving me free rein to explore and develop my own views without trying to impose his views upon me.
So what is, in a nutshell, the argument from Kalam, Bill?
It's a very simple argument. It goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And having arrived at that conclusion, you can then do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. And you find that a number of striking theological properties of this first uncaused cause come out of such an analysis, so that it gives us a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe.
What we usually call God, isn't that how it's phrased in the video? Yes. So relating then to your threefold understanding of apologetics, in what way does this argument challenge non-Christians?
It challenges agnostics and atheists who deny the existence of God. It also challenges, Lars, the adherents of any other world religion that is outside of the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and perhaps deism. Because if this argument is correct, pantheism is false. The universe is contingent and has a transcendent creator. Polytheism is false. So the argument narrows down the field of the world's religions to basically those great monotheistic faiths which posit a transcendent creator.
When you mentioned that, I was reminded of, I think it was C.S. Lewis who said that when man is left to himself, he tends to move towards pantheism in one way or another. That's a fascinating comment. So maybe we shouldn't underestimate the attraction of also that kind of thinking.
Yes, that's right. And of course, there are many world religions such as Buddhism and Hinduism, which are pantheistic in nature. And this challenges the adherents of those religions on the basis of the arguments for the beginning of the universe and its contingency.
As you have presented and argued for the Kalam argument in so many contexts, it's really an exploration, isn't it, of the relationship between the Christian doctrine of a creator and cosmology.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And that would be related to that third function of apologetics, the integrative nature. I think theologians need to study a little bit of contemporary cosmology to do an adequate job with the doctrine of creation, and in particular, creatio ex nihilo, creation of nothing, out of nothing.
So Theology 103 course, cosmology maybe.
I would include it. And when I teach my survey of Christian doctrine in my Sunday school class at our church, we spend a good deal of time talking about cosmology and creation.
So, then going finally to the second dimension about how the Kalam argument may function in relationship to Christians.
Well, of course, so many Christians have been told that modern science is incompatible with traditional Christian belief. And when they learn that the Christian doctrine of creation is right in line with the standard model of contemporary cosmology and astrophysics, this is a huge revelation to them and a tremendous confidence booster. So I like to explain to people that contemporary physics is very open and sympathetic to the idea of a cosmic creator and designer.
So in a way, we are opening up to an exploration of reality from saying that the Christian faith is open towards reality and actually affirms reality as it is.
Yes, and in that sense, the Christian can be much more open-minded to follow the evidence where it leads than, say, the determined naturalist who cannot accept the idea of the beginning of the universe because he has no cause to bring it into existence. And so his naturalism will actually be an impediment to good scientific work on cosmogony.
And now I understand that the Kalam argument is being discussed in so many contexts today, actually both theological and philosophical. Isn't that right?
Yes, and scientific. I can point you to articles in physics journals where this is discussed. So in a multiplicity of contexts, the argument is penetrating and having an influence.
Well, it's wonderful just to get that overview. And of course, we could have spent the rest of the time going just into that argument, but we need to move on, I'm afraid, to the fine-tuning argument. And it seems as if even people with a very aggressive attitude towards the Christian faith talk about apparent design or the appearance of fine-tuning, like someone like Richard Dawkins, for example.
Yes, that's right.
And the other observation is interesting, that even though Christians within, let's say, conservative or more classical Christian circles would disagree on evolution, for example, would disagree on whether intelligent design is possible to detect on a lower level. It seems that many Christians can agree on the overall fine-tuning of the universe at the macro level.
Yes, that's right, Lars. It's important that your listeners understand that this argument does not concern the origin of biological complexity on this planet. Rather, this argument goes right back to the very beginning of the universe and shows that in order for intelligent life to exist anywhere in the cosmos, the Big Bang itself, from the moment of its inception, needs to be incomprehensibly fine-tuned for the existence of embodied intelligent life. So, to take your example of Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, he uses biological evolution to explain away the appearance of biological design. But he admits that science has no plausible explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe, which physics uncovers.
Fascinating to reflect on this together, Bill. And I seem to recall that in the debate between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox, the famous Alabama debate, I think, or maybe there or another place, Dawkins talk about that cosmology is waiting for its Darwin.
Yes, that's right. He admits it, that he hasn't come along yet. There isn't a robust explanation for this fine-tuning. And you see, the problem is because these fundamental constants and quantities that are so finely tuned are initial conditions that can't be explained as a result of a process of evolution over time.
So if you would phrase the fine-tuning argument in a brief way, how would you do that?
Very simply, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or to chance, therefore it is due to design. So if the premises of this argument are true, it gives you a cosmic designer.
Well, that's very simply put, Bill.
Yes, and so the heart of the argument will be that second premise where you offer criticisms of the hypothesis of physical necessity. And there's someone like Dawkins is very candid. He says you can't explain it plausibly as saying it had to be that way. You could have had different values for these parameters. So Dawkins, on scientific grounds, not religious grounds, rejects the explanation of physical necessity. As for the hypothesis of chance, well, there, someone like Roger Penrose offers scientific reasons for thinking that you cannot explain the fine-tuning by appealing to some sort of a multiverse hypothesis of randomly ordered worlds in which our world would appear simply by chance. So what you have here are two secular thinkers who each rejects one of the two explanations that is a competitor to design based on purely scientific reasoning. And that leaves design then as the best explanation of the fine-tuning.
for some of the listeners, Roger Penrose may not be a familiar name. I think you met him recently, didn't you? In
I did. What a privilege.
With
yes,
Justin
on
Brierley.
Justin Brierley's program. Sir Roger Penrose, he's knighted.
We need to be appropriate here to call him sir. Yes.
He's one of the greatest, not only one of the greatest living physicists, I would say one of the greatest physicists of all time. He's legendary. He helped develop with Stephen Hawking the famous Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems that confirmed the standard model of the Big Bang.
Well, these are certainly fascinating areas, which again, we could have spent at least all our time on each one of those, but now we're trying to build a sort of comprehensive picture together.
Yes.
And then usually you move then to a third argument, the moral argument. And I think you say sometimes that that's where people get personally involved.
Yes, exactly, because you can live life ignoring the evidence for the beginning of the universe or the fine-tuning of the universe. Just shut your eyes and you can get along fine. But you can't shut your eyes to the problem of moral values and duties, because every day you wake up, you answer the question, do people have intrinsic, inherent moral value by the way in which you treat other people? Are they just means to be used for your ends, or are they ends in themselves, endowed with intrinsic moral worth? And so the argument is really inescapable, and that gives it a greater existential bite.
And we are talking both about objective moral values and objective moral duties, aren't we?
Yes, initially I didn't distinguish these two, but then I came to see that these are actually quite different. Moral values have to do with what is good and evil. Moral duties have to do with obligations, right and wrong. What are our moral obligations? What are our moral prohibitions? And so there's the question of values on the one hand. Are moral values objective or just subjective? And then there's the question of moral duties on the other hand. Do I have moral obligations and prohibitions, things that I ought to do, other things that I ought not to do, or are these just illusory?
When you communicate this argument and do it in a nutshell, how do you express it then?
I do it by the following simple argument. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Second, but objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows logically, 3, therefore God exists.
And we've talked about here how these different arguments, how they affect people. And how does this argument affect someone who doesn't, what in your experience, doesn't believe in God?
Well, they find themselves very conflicted, Lars, because they tend to believe both premises, but they've never connected the dots. They've never put it together. So, for example, if you say to someone, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. If there is no God, there's no absolute and objective standard of good and evil, right and wrong. Moral values are just the subjective spin-offs of the biological and social evolutionary process. And they'll tend to agree with that, but they'll say, well, but maybe there aren't any objective moral values and duties then. And then you move to the second premise and say, well, don't you think it's wrong to be a racist? Don't you think it's wrong to be homophobic? And you just ask questions, and very quickly, 98% of people will say, well, yeah, I guess that there are objective moral values and duties after all, but these don't come from God. And then you go back to the first premise and say, but if God does not exist, then there aren't any objective moral values. And you go back and forth between these two premises, trying to help people put it together and see that the values and the duties that they really do believe in and hold to actually imply the existence of God.
So in a way, there is a tension, deep tension between what one claims to be true and the moral intuitions one has.
Yes, I find
who doesn't believe in God.
Yes, students will give lip service to relativism. That is, say they'll agree with the first premise. But if you talk to students, it becomes very evident that they are deeply committed to certain values. For example, the value of tolerance. They think it's objectively wrong to impose your values on someone else. So they are moral objectivists, moral realists. They believe in the value of love, of open-mindedness, of treating other people with respect and equal dignity, so that they really do have a deep moral commitment, even though they'll give lip service to relativism.
To your experience, Bill, from presenting this in so many different contexts, what is the reaction of Christians to this?
I find that Christians really resonate with this argument. They will typically raise some of the same objections. I think a very common objection is, well, couldn't moral values and duties just be the result of biological evolution and social conditioning? I think that's the one you hear most often. And my reply to that is to say, that's exactly right. And that's why if God does not exist as a transcendent anchor for these, that's all moral values and duties are. Just subjective byproducts of biological and social evolution. So I agree with you about that. If there is no God, then that's all that morality amounts to.
You use the expression transcendent anchor.
Yes.
That's a lovely expression. It sort of indicates that the anchorage is outside of ourselves.
Right. We need something that will transcend society and history, so as to give us a viewpoint that is valid universally and objectively. If you don't have that transcendent anchor, then you are lost in socio-cultural relativism. Every culture and society has its own values, and none can claim that its values are true and objective and everyone else is wrong.
In terms of the whole area of morality, I mean, that's definitely an area where a lot of people, whether people are religious or Christians within that category of religious or not, or very secular, people are concerned about ethics and are concerned about morality. So how do you think we as Christians can thinking again about this third dimension of apologetics, revealing and exploring the areas here, the connections between the Christian doctrine, which we have talked about now, and the whole area of morality?
Well, I think that one of the things we can do is to reflect on examples that would resonate with people in our secular culture to help them see that they really do believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties. So I mentioned a couple. I mentioned racism. I mentioned homophobia. These are very sensitive spots. And virtually everyone will want to say that it's morally wrong to discriminate against another person because of his skin color or sexual orientation. I like to use religious examples. Don't you think that the medieval Crusades were wrong? Don't you think that the Spanish Inquisition was wrong, that it's wrong to burn people at the stake for being Jewish? And I don't think I've ever heard anybody yet who will say, yeah, those things were really morally indifferent. It doesn't matter. These kinds of examples of religious abuse the immorality, the sexual abuse recently exposed in the Catholic Church of priests abusing little boys, and then higher officials trying to cover it up by moving the priest to another diocese. People are deeply morally offended at that kind of abuse of children. And so using examples like that can be very effective in helping people to see that they really do believe in the objectivity of moral value and duty.
So what I'm hearing from you also, Bill, it seems to me that we shouldn't be afraid of admitting that the church as a sort of collective body has also committed things that are morally wrong and even morally appalling. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, I think that's right. We of all people recognize that man is sinful, and therefore we should not be surprised that sinful man will take the best and most beautiful things like religious belief itself and pervert it for evil purposes and selfish ends. We shouldn't be surprised at that at all, and so should acknowledge it when it happens.
So far, Bill, we have explored the whole area of the existence of God, and we have talked about the God as the first uncaused cause, and God as the one who has designed the universe with the initial constants and so on, and then the whole area of morality, indicating that we are more than biology, we are more than chemistry, we are created with, well, as human beings in the image of God, then going back to the whole question about the historical Adam. But then saying that all this points to a transcendent anchor for life, for the universe, for life, and for morality. And then someone came on the scene 2,000 years ago, called Jesus from Nazareth. And you have spent also a lot of time on the historical questions.
Yes. After my doctoral work in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, I received a fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to study in Germany for 2 years under Wolfhard Pannenberg, working on the historical credibility of the resurrection of Jesus. And again, this was quite a surprise to me to find how the principal facts undergirding the inference to Jesus' historical resurrection are accepted today by the wide majority of New Testament scholars, not conservative or evangelical scholars alone, but the wide mainstream of New Testament scholarship, so that a very plausible case can be made for God's self-revelation in Jesus of Nazareth. The arguments that we've discussed so far give us a transcendent personal creator and designer of the universe who is the locus of absolute goodness. And now we want to know, has this designer and creator in the universe revealed himself to us in some way in the world so that we can know him more closely? And Jesus claimed to be just such a revelation of God. And so we need to look at his claims and his person, his teachings, his works, and I think especially his alleged resurrection from the dead. Because if God has raised this man from the dead, he has vindicated this man's personal claims to be the revelation of God to humanity.
So when you arrived there in Germany to Wolfhard Pannenberg, that was, you said, a new discovery for you to see that there were so many people working in that area. Could you describe something? We talked about John Hickory, a few minutes ago. For the benefit of our listeners, who is Wolfhard Pannenberg?
Wolfhard Pannenberg was a Protestant systematic theologian at the University of Munich. And he rocked German liberal theology by arguing that God had raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead, thereby vindicating his person and work, and that this could be shown historically, not simply apprehended by faith, but that one could give a good historical argument for the event of the resurrection. And Palmenbar, being so unusual in this respect, I wanted to study under him and work on the resurrection of Jesus under his direction.
And of course, as you said, that was a fundamental break with the different models in theology like Karl Barth or Rudolf Bultmann or whoever before, and the radical break. But I think you tell the story when you came to him in the first place and he gave you 2, 3, 4 books, wasn't it?
Yes, you've got a good memory of our biography. Jan and I had actually been living in France for 1 year prior to the beginning of the Humboldt Fellowship and our moving to Munich. And so we had learned French during that year. And when I arrived at the university in Munich and met with Palmenbar, he took me into the theological seminars library and pulled 3 books off the shelf and said, let's see, why don't you get started by reading this, and this. And one of the books was in German and the other 2 were in French. And I thought, oh, Lord, thank you. Because I could never have said to Professor Palmenbar, well, I'm afraid I don't read French. You know, it was just expected. And so I just thought that was a remarkable illustration of the Lord's providence and timing.
Wonderful to hear that little biographical reminiscence there. And then you plunged into your studies and has actually produced a number of books out of that as well.
Yes.
And so we are taking our route through the different videos here that are being subtitled into Norwegian, and 3 of them, as we mentioned, are about what we're talking about now, about the historical evidence. The first one is then about Jesus.
Yes.
And that is about the claims of Jesus. Who did Jesus say he was?
That's right.
And
this is critical.
It's critical, yes. What is
this is critical because, as David Hume said, a miracle without a context is inherently ambiguous. In order to discern the significance of a miracle, we need to look at the religio-historical context in which it occurred. And the resurrection of Jesus is so significant because it's not just the resurrection of somebody or anybody. It's the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, whose crucifixion was instigated by the Jewish authorities because of his allegedly blasphemous claims, whereby he put himself in the very place of God and arrogated to himself an authority belonging properly to God alone. So if this man has been raised from the dead, that is a dramatic and public confirmation of those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified.
So it's giving us the background evidence, as it were, or the religious historical context of
right.
the resurrection.
Right.
So in briefly, what did Jesus say about himself?
What I tried to show is that Jesus claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, that is to say, the long-awaited King of Israel who would establish the throne of David in Jerusalem and establish his kingdom and rule, that he believed that he was the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings or holy men, and that he believed that he was the divine human Son of Man prophesied in the Old Testament by the prophet Daniel, to whom all judgment and authority on earth would be given. And all 3 of those titles come together in the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in the Gospels, where Jesus claims to be the Messiah, the Son of Man, and the Son of God.
So it's like a composite composite picture coming together of the various facets there, isn't it?
Yes, and those just concern the so-called titles that Jesus claimed. In addition to that, there is a kind of implicit Christology in his claim to do miracles, to perform exorcisms and control the demonic authorities, in his revising the Old Testament law in his own authority, in his claim to forgive sins. There's an implicit Christology as well in all of those activities and claims that augment what the titles themselves
so in a way, we are talking about sometimes that all the roads lead to Rome. In this case, all the roads lead to who Jesus is and the resurrection.
Yeah, that's right.
So when you are presenting these claims of Jesus, the explicit and the implicit, how do people react? In a way, it's interesting, isn't it? It seems to me that many people want to be on the side of Jesus. Very few people have a very antagonistic view of Jesus, it seems. But it's
true.
So how do people then, let's say outside the church, non-Christians, how do they relate to the kind of evidence you present? Because it's challenging, isn't it? Because Jesus is not just a good man, a moral teacher, but it's much more than, it includes that, but it's much more than that.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I have not had much by way of response to the points that we've just been discussing on the claims of Christ. People will respond to arguments about the resurrection of Jesus, but frankly, I haven't received much pushback or response to the claims that Jesus made.
What do you think the reason could be for that?
Well, one reason may be, Lars, that in these presentations that I give on a university campus, it's so brief that one can't go into much detail on this. And so I do tend to focus on the evidence for the resurrection rather than the claims that Jesus made himself. So in all fairness, they haven't been the focus of my lectures. But then in addition, I think that the non-Christian student is just so unfamiliar with the Gospels. He's probably never read them, that he just has no idea of what Jesus said and did, or any basis for questioning it. He just draws a blank, I think. At that.
Yeah, and maybe then compared to the resurrection, it feels so absurd to believe for many people that someone rose from the dead, that it's easier to mobilize maybe objections to that. Could that be true?
Yes, I think that's right, because that's miraculous. There's no miracle involved in somebody making extraordinary claims. Anybody can make false or exaggerated claims, right? But to rise from the dead, well, that would be a miracle. And so you have easy slogans that are offered in response, like extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. And the evidence just isn't extraordinary enough to justify belief in the resurrection. And that excuses them from for their intellectual laziness and their ignoring what evidence there is.
So when we're talking about Christians' responses on the other hand, how do people respond to both to the claims of Jesus and to the resurrection?
Well, I find that Christians find this often eye-opening, that they will say, I never realized that the evidence is this good. And so there is a very positive reaction to these sorts of historical apologetics. I think Christians understand that here you're talking about, the very heart of their faith. Arguments for the existence of God could be equally offered by a Muslim or a Jew. But when you get to the claims and resurrection of Jesus, this is Christianity exclusively. And so Christians, I think, really resonate with this. And so I think you'll find among popular level Christian apologists like Lee Strobel, Frank Turek, J. Warner Wallace, and many others that appeal to the evidence for the resurrection will be part and parcel of what they usually do.
And could that also be related to the fact that death is something we are all facing, you know, and there's an existential element to this as well, that in fact the resurrection connects, you know, it connects with evidence, with historical exploration, but also with a very deep existential reality, doesn't it?
Yes, and this is the way I present it in my books. When I have more time than I do in a lecture, I begin by talking about the human predicament of a life doomed to end in death and personal extinction, and how that puts a question mark behind everything that one lives for, and how the resurrection of Jesus then provides an answer to the human predicament by offering eternal life.
I can recall actually listening to, I think it must be many years ago, when you were in Gothenburg, I think, and I listened to, I think it was a 1-hour presentation by you on the resurrection, which really was in a way very powerful, because it was, you know, you commanded the material in a way that you were able to communicate freely to us. And I think you communicated something very, something very deeply meaningful, that this is not just a theory that we are sharing, but it's a deep conviction.
Yeah.
Do you come across that kind of response from Christians that I just shared from my own experience?
I think so. I find that Christians really resonate with this and adopt it readily. One doesn't find much pushback here or reluctance. Theologians might say, well, the attempt to appeal to evidence is contrary to the nature of faith, which is always a risk, and can't be guided by evidence or reason. But I don't find lay people taking that line. I find lay people appreciate the evidence, resonate with it, and go with it enthusiastically.
Well, wonderful to hear that. And we are actually almost towards the end of our walk together, this time at least. And it seems to me that we have been talking about an overall picture of, you mentioned before we started with referring to the videos about the Christian worldview being something very, it's comprehensive, it's coherent, and it's compelling.
Yes. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, just look at the truths that we've discussed today. A creator and designer of the universe, who is the locus of absolute moral goodness, who loves us, the intrinsic value of human beings, their fallenness into evil and need of moral forgiveness and cleansing, the provision of this through Christ, and the opportunity to find eternal life and a personal relationship with God forever. Or these are compelling truths that if there's any good reason to believe in these, they compel us to believe, I think.
I mentioned that I have the privilege of serving within the Lausanne movement in various contexts, and we are almost approaching exactly 10 years since the Cape Town Congress, which was the last major Congress in 2010. And out of that came the Cape Town Commitment. And in the preface to that, there is a wonderful expression that we are called as Christians to bear witness to Jesus Christ and all his teaching in every nation of the world, in every sphere of society, and then in the realm of ideas. And so bearing witness to Jesus Christ and all his teaching in the realm of ideas. And that relates to something I briefly touched on in our conversation or email exchange before, that there is many Christians today seem to experience this tension between what they have, if they had grown up in a Christian home, or at least been taught within a church, and then they encounter so many claims outside the church in terms of the media stories, or the claims within the news media, or the implicit claims through the entertainment media, various kinds, and then of course through the whole education and higher education system. And then there is this sense of cognitive dissonance, of the tension between the claims of the Christian faith and their own experience. I think what we have shared together is really a way forward, isn't it? To explore the claims of the Christian faith, of the Christian worldview, with open eyes, and there is nothing to fear.
Right. So as to resolve that cognitive dissonance. In fact, I want to go on the offensive. I want to cause cognitive dissonance for secularists and non-believing students, to put some dissonance into their uncritically accepted worldview by presenting arguments and evidence that suggests that something's not right and needs to be resolved.
That's right. So there is this double meaning or double approach there. And it seems to me that we have covered a lot of ground, and we could have continued for another hour, but we don't have time for that. So I would like to express thanks and our gratitude to you, Bill, for joining us today. And we do hope that our videos, well, I'm calling it our videos now,
yes,
the subtitle videos that we were partnered with to subtitle into Norwegian, that they will really be efficient also in a Norwegian context to portray each piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and together they make a compelling picture of the Christian faith. Is there anything finally you would like to share with the Norwegian listeners?
Well, I just want to say that I want to tell your listeners that Jan and I stand shoulder to shoulder with the Norwegian church and with the Christians there in their efforts to defend and to spread the gospel. We are so appreciative of the church in Norway, and feel partnered with you in our hearts and in our minds.
Thank you very much, Bill, and God's blessings, rich blessings on your ministry, and as a couple, and also on all your co-workers within the Reasonable Faith ministry. And thank you for today, and hopefully we'll connect maybe in a year's time and talk about how did things work out.
Yes, that's better. Thank you.